recording here as well. Thanks for having us along, and I'd love to talk to you today about what we call AnonCreds Independence. This is a pun that I mostly came up with, but we've stuck with it. But to get started, I'm Ankit Banerjee. I'm the CTO and co-founder at Checked. One of our, we are one of the companies that are partnering with Animo, and Animo are partnering with us. And we have been for the past few months and been working very closely together. But maybe just as a show of hands, I want to understand how many people here have heard of Checked before or got an explanation of what we do. Okay, a few hands. Most people have heard about it. Okay. And how familiar are you with what we do? Okay, you've heard about us, but do you understand what the proposition is? And show of hands? Okay, a bit less. So I'll try and run through some of the ideas over here. I think because this is relatively small as an audience, I'm happy to take any questions. So the general idea is that at the moment, when you get your identity verified online, you typically go through a process which is, you might have been told as selfie scan check, which is they ask you to take a selfie, take a picture of your passport or your driver's license or some kind of document, or upload a PDF, and then it goes off to a company that checks if this is accurate or not. Now, the problem with that process is that it's the problem with that process is that it tends to be quite slow, and it's also quite expensive. So when you think about the kinds of identity checks, sometimes it can take minutes online, or sometimes it takes weeks, and it costs anywhere between, say, $5 or €5 for a simple check, checking your date, your name, and whether you've got the right documents to back that up, all the way to if you are looking at the identity of companies, or you're trying to get through a company check, a criminal record check, it can go quite expensive. And so what we think is quite problematic here is that this is one of the major issues with why companies aren't necessarily adopting self-sovereign identity. Because when you get your identity verified by a company, they have probably spent a significant amount of money taking you through that check process. Now, that might not be direct spend with the company. It could also be just the human effort that they have put into that check. So sort of a blended cost. So we think this could be made to work slightly differently if companies were able to issue SSI credentials that we carried around in our own wallets. And the next time that we were asked to prove our identity, if we provided the self-sovereign identity wallet, and the issuers who gave this piece of data to you, or this piece of information that they had spent their own time, money, and effort checking, if they were able to get compensated for some of that, then we think that starts creating an ecosystem where companies want to give you your data back in a trustable and portable fashion. And so looking at, and this is sort of insights that me and my co-founder Fraser, we derive from having worked through a lot of the very large SSI projects that have been happening. And so where this sort of takes us to is a model or an ecosystem where perhaps there are certain scenarios in which holders or the subjects of the information get paid. A good example of this is if I have a passport, I probably have paid my government £90 or €100 or something along those lines to get the passport. So if a bank asks me to prove my identity and they ask me to provide my passport, it's easier for them to check it if I give it to them in a digitally and cryptographically trustable fashion. And that reduces the cost that they have to go through. Whereas there might be other scenarios, for example, where it's not a passport, I haven't bought it directly, it's not directly in my control, but it could, for example, be a gym membership that I have. It could be like a WeWork pass. It could be the output of like going through a banking sort of know your customer check. Those could be scenarios in which the originator of that sort of digital information is the one who gets compensated. And what that sort of like, starts like, I think, creating is not just recurring sort of like, revenue streams in terms of like subscription fees for companies that are working in self-sovereign identity. So at the moment, a lot of like self-sovereign ID companies have business models where you either charge for consultancy or services, or you charge for subscription to the software platform. But we think there's also a network that can essentially be created where you don't just get compensated for that kind of direct sort of software subscription model, but also just usage of credentials. And I think that sort of aligns up the incentives of like everyone to try and have more self-sovereign identity, more data in control for the individuals who are involved. And this doesn't need to necessarily be a single ecosystem. I think there will be tens and thousands and hundreds of thousands of like, different ecosystems that can all sort of like, talk to each other. And what I mean by that is this doesn't necessarily mean that every single digital credential has one single price. The cost of like checking someone's identity in Cambodia is very different than the cost of checking someone's identity in Netherlands. And also it depends on the industry. So for example, an insurance file containing your health records might have a lot more information in it and might be a lot more valuable than just trying to see if you're above the age of 18 or not. Does that make sense so far? Like, does anybody want to ask any questions? Yes? No? Good. Okay. Yes?
I agree with you.
Yeah.
But doesn't that, so how do you determine the price then? Because
Sure.
What the value is of a certain piece of data is maybe even hard to know at the time that you ask.
Sure. We think it should be a marketplace that is dependent on the issuer to determine like what the price of that like data is. And there will be market forces that sort of like drive it at a particular spot. And I'll give an example over here. So Stripe, I don't know if you've heard of them. They're a bit like Adyen, which is pretty big as a Dutch startup, I understand. So Stripe is one of the world's largest credit card processors. And because of that fact, they're really able to quickly detect fraud and do identity checks. The crazy thing is, right now, your debit card or your PIN card or your credit card is one of the most common ways in which ID checks are carried out online. So when you open up an app and you enter into Uber, they ask you for your credit card. They put €1 or like a 50-cent charge on the card, and they check your name and they check your postcode. And that's how often a lot of these ID checks are carried out. So what they've done is they now allow ID verifications at just about 35 pence or £1.25. And that's significantly 5 times to maybe 10 times cheaper than what a traditional ID check provider does. So that's an example of like once you start bringing in the volume, that sort of like price starts moving down. So that's an actual demonstration of like how these price points could move. But one of the biggest questions that we get over here is, does this mean you're going to get an encrypted and locked credential? Doesn't that defeat the whole point of having a self-sovereign credential? And we agree, like you shouldn't have a locked credential because then everybody has an incentive to create their own locked credential. It's a bit like how HP or Canon lock their own printer cartridges to their own printers. So you start having an incentive to build in mechanisms that lock you in. I think same goes up, I think, for Nespresso pods and whatnot as well. So the general idea is that you can have a self-sovereign ID credential that you control and you hold and is based on industry and open standards that you can show to anyone at any time for free. And they're able to cryptographically and digitally check that the information in here is absolutely accurate. However, if you wanted to find out is the credential currently valid, that's a different question, and it's a property often belonging to the issuer of that credential. Let me give an example. So I have a passport that was given by the UK government, and let's say I lose it. Then I tell the government that that passport needs to be cancelled, but then actually I look around in my backpack and I find it later, like the old passport. It's still a valid document in the sense that it is a legitimate document. If I was using it to prove my age, I could probably still go and use it. However, if I was using it for travel, it's not valid in that context. Or for example, if I went to buy alcohol, I could just show my driver's license and they can see that I'm above the age of 18 or 25 or 21, depending on the jurisdiction. But if I wanted to go rent a car, then they probably want to do a live lookup against a driver's license database to see if my driver's license has been cancelled because I've got any bad sort of like driving incidents or not. And so what we think like should be charged for is checking the access to is the credential currently revoked or not, rather than necessarily locking the credential and preventing it from spreading. So some like use cases, I think it's completely fine to just show here's a digital credential that says something about me, whereas in others, the recipient of that might want to pay for checking is this still valid or not. Does that make sense? Like any other questions again? Like I'll pause for a sec.
Yes, I'm wondering the way revocation works in self-sovereign identity now is that it preserves the privacy of the holder versus the issuer. So the issuer doesn't know that the revocation is being
correct.
checked. So I'm curious how you're going to attribute the value to a revocation transaction and still preserve that.
Yeah, we completely agree with that as well. Like there's, I'll repeat the question. So the question was, at the moment, some of the revocation mechanisms that exist in SSI, they do it in a privacy preserving fashion, as in the issuer does not necessarily know when the credential is being used to prove that revocation, right?
Necessarily not.
Necessarily. Yeah.
It's a given that he doesn't know.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's
Sure. Well, it depends because that's true for the Hyperledger Indy way of doing revocation, but not for some of the other ones in the industry, which is why.
But it defines the purpose of
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. So how do we plan on preserving the privacy of like the individuals or the data subjects while that payment is made? So I completely agree that there are, for example, some revocation mechanisms right now that are not privacy preserving. They're essentially a lookup against a centralized database or a centralized API to see, is this credential still valid? So we do think like the idea behind how Hyperledger Indy preserves the privacy of the individual is important. In terms of the payment mechanism, therefore, we don't think it should be done as an atomic transfer between the recipient and the issuer. So it's not an atomic transfer for every single check because that could be correlated. And the second thing we don't want to do is we also know that, for example, issuers might put a very precise price on a credential that they've issued and use that to correlate it back to an individual. So for example, they give you a credential and they price it at 0.0675384. And they know that when they get paid exactly that amount, you've gone and used it at a particular place. So the way that we want to tackle that is by doing escrow-based payments, where the verifiers only pay in aggregate into an escrow account, and that escrow account on a periodic basis pays out to issuers. So to keep the cryptographic sort of like checks in place, that the issuers and the verifiers or the recipients have the knowledge that the payments that they're due are being made, but to not do it like in a single sort of like in a transfer basis. I think the other advantage of that is it also saves you on fees. So because you're not paying fees for every single individual microtransaction. Does that make sense?
How is that handled? Is that some sort of smart contract that handles that?
Right. Yeah. So that part of like the system is like something we are still building, but the essential sort of like idea is to try and keep the payments between the recipients and the issuers only in aggregate, which adds a level of like blinding and doesn't necessarily correlate back to any individual credential being used. So they'll know in aggregate that.
Payments to that smart contract. I mean, it's not being done.
Sure.
The design idea is that payments to that smart contract are also not visible to the owner.
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question, like, is it being done using a smart contract, and how are, payments to that smart contract handled? The more precise answer is we're looking at like techniques, for example, like secret network, which essentially uses trusted execution environments. So it allows you to execute a smart contract while keeping the details of the transaction itself non-public. Okay. Yes.
The owner of the smart contract could still somehow correlate back to all the requests.
I guess it depends on your definition of owner of a smart contract. I think owner of a smart contract is more valid for Ethereum, where you have like a public ledger where one particular contract address owns it. So we built on something called the Cosmos blockchain framework, where you don't necessarily have the same like idea of like an owner of a smart contract. You have essentially the same sort of like software logic that is being run by multiple nodes. So I guess you could say like theoretically nodes may be able to figure out at egress or ingress, but I think that's necessarily true for even Hyperledger Indy right now. So every time you're returning a response over some kind of like web link, anybody who was sufficiently wanted to interrogate that probably could.
That's
So
the reason why then
yeah,
everybody needs to trust the node, whether it's
yeah,
whatever.
correct. But that's why we want to use something like secret network, where the actual details of the transaction themselves are shielded outside of the trusted execution environment. And this is actually live and in use by quite a few of the different like Cosmos blockchain framework networks. So anything outside that particular TE cannot read it, but I think there have been demonstrated attacks where you can go into trusted execution environments and you can have like side channel attacks that extract that information, but I think you can theoretically compromise any system, right? Okay, so what that sort of like I think ultimately brings it to, and I think this is good, like I think it gives a good baseline for people, is we want to get it to a point where, for example, companies are actually making attempts to give portable data containers with people's information to them. And I don't just mean KYC, I mean all kinds of their online personal profiles. So right now, if I wanted to easily move from like, one particular forum to another, one particular game platform to another, one particular, say, online social media service to another, none of those are enabled easily by SSI right now, and neither is like a lot of other different use cases. I think if we have a mechanism though where the issuers of like the data or the holders of that data get compensated, I think it starts creating a flywheel. This particular one is a modification of one that Amazon came in with, which is once you improve the user experience, more people start demanding and using it, which means more like places accept it. In their case, it was merchants who start using the Amazon marketplace and the platform. And the larger like outside part of the flywheel that they call it is when Amazon started sort of like snowballing, the cost of creating that trusted data goes down. and the cost of like consuming that also goes down. So what we think is, if instead of like constantly paying $5 or £5 or £50 for a check of identity, if we can drive that down to lower levels, so that lowers the cost of consuming it, but it also lowers the cost for creating the next sort of like iterations of that trusted data. I'll stop again for any questions. No? Cool. So how do we go about building this? So we didn't build on Hyperledger Indy. There are some like various different users. As an open source project, I think its health isn't doing as well recently. And I think in terms, and that's just an example from GitHub on the sort of like code commit activity, but at the same time, I'm not particularly religious about any blockchain. I know a lot of blockchain people are. I'm not necessarily religious about blockchain in general either. At the time, we built on Cosmos blockchain framework because it was the most mature at the time and had a sort of rich open source ecosystem for tools that we wanted to use. I think some of the other sort of like issues with Hyperledger Indy tend to come in on scalability as well, and we can go into some of the technical details later if needed. But what we wanted to do is we also wanted something that was, for example, Hyperledger Indy is 1 transaction per block. Now that's a huge bottleneck when you go at scale, whether you're doing revocation or issuance. And it's also in terms of like the compute that it uses, it's significantly higher. So we wanted something energy efficient. And for that reason, we also wanted to explore how can we have decentralized governance as well into the mix, because at the moment, the reason why there are so many different Hyperledger Indy sort of small networks is because Indy networks have a limitation on how many nodes can participate in it. The consensus slows down beyond like use if you have more than 25 nodes, and doesn't have a lot of fault tolerance below 7. So it's a very tight like margin within which you can have a Hyperledger Indy network, which is also a challenge if we have to make SSI big. If you think of using SSI for like tens of millions of citizens and multiple industry sectors, it's not going to happen like if you're relying on a very brittle network like that. So we knew that like it had to be significantly larger than that, and we also wanted to then look at like how would you do the governance. The second piece was we didn't want to build it on something energy intensive as Ethereum. This slide is a bit dated because obviously Ethereum has done the proof of stake migration today, but it still has the second problem, which we call the Elon Musk problem, where literally everything happens on Ethereum impacts the usage, the price, and the congestion on the network for each other. So for example, I don't know if you've heard of an NFT collection called Bored Ape Yacht Club. When they dropped their new collection, it was basically clogged for 2 days. Like nothing went through. So we wanted to avoid that problem because if you have an identity use case, you can't necessarily pay $500 in fees because something in Bored Ape Yacht Club, shot the price up across the whole network, as well as things getting stuck because maybe there's a new penguin NFT or something that becomes super popular. So ultimately, like our goal was like we wanted to build something and implement Hyperledger Indy-ish sort of techniques and frameworks, but something that was more modern and more scalable. I think also to cover at this point, Hyperledger Indy was one of the pioneers in the blockchain framework, and I still would say for SSI it is. But there are certain aspects of it that aren't in line with the standards. So for example, you cannot create decentralized identifier documents or DID documents that are complex or have like a lot of like different fields in them. So it basically cannot implement the full World Wide Web Consortium or W3C standards for DIDs. It only allows for certain parts of it to be implemented. A good example of this is you can only have a single key in terms of the controller. So if you only have a single key, whereas the DID spec allows you to have multiple keys and complex relationships between them, you cannot do that on Hyperledger Indy right now. So we also wanted to account for that in our spec. And this is something Timo will talk about later, but what we looked at is, having said that, I think from a user experience perspective, we can't tell people to download 20 different apps. I think that's never going to fly. And there is a distinct divide within the SSI world right now, where there are some companies and some wallet applications that do AnonCreds and AnonCreds only, and there are other wallet applications and networks that do JSON or JWTVC only. And so we are talking about a user-friendly and user-centric and interoperable standard, but realistically right now, what people have to do is probably download 15 different apps. So our thinking on this was we didn't necessarily, we think the AnonCreds or IndyCreds, they will stick around for a long time, the same way that I still have vinyl records and people might still have VHS tapes at home, because of legacy reasons. So we need to accommodate that. I think there are some fantastic aspects of the AnonCreds spec itself that other credential formats should adopt. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, what we'd love to do is to have an SDK that allows you to handle AnonCreds as well as other kinds of credentials. So whether that be the rest of the W3C spec credentials or AnonCreds unchecked. So I think we had that sort of right from the beginning. And we'll obviously go into more with Timo on that. How am I doing for time? Probably okay? 30 minutes? Yeah, okay. Good. So AnonCreds unchecked is the bit that we'll talk about next and how we sort of approach this. Sorry, before I go ahead, how many people have heard the term AnonCreds? Could you raise your hand and let me know? Okay, and so you're familiar with the specification. So AnonCreds are fantastic. I think one of the problems, though, is that although AnonCreds are great, there are many parts of their implementation that was supposed to be independent of Hyperledger Indy, but the way that it has been actually done over the past 4 to 5 years means they're very specifically tied to Hyperledger Indy. So for example, they might assume that a transaction ID or a reference is an integer number, which is true when you have one transaction per block, as Hyperledger Indy does, but a lot of other blockchains or even non-blockchain decentralized systems might not make that assumption. For example, in Cosmos blockchain framework, you can have 100 transactions inside a block. So you don't use the number of the block to determine what it should be. So we started looking at the generic problem of how do we make sure that all of the bits that AnonCreds requires could be implemented on Ledger. And actually, when we started going deeper into it, we thought outside of AnonCreds, there's a huge problem. So outside of AnonCreds, in fact, the issue is a lot of JSON and JSON LD credentials will use web URLs to implement schemas and other things like that. So a schema is how a credential looks. And I think that's a bit hypocritical. You're saying you need to have decentralized identifiers so that the keys can be maintained and they're decentralized, but then something crucial that you need to understand the credential just goes to a web link. So, and that sort of really did not compute for me. And the reason why that's important is because they help you understand what the credential is. They can also change over time. So we have different sort of like, let's say, license formats that might evolve over the years. But a person who receives the credential should be able to understand that at one point in time it looked like this, now it looks like this, but can I go and fetch the old one? And is it always sort of like available? One thing I love about this is after Brexit, the UK changed its passport to a blue color, but they had to give the contract to a French company and shut down a factory in the UK because that particular shade of blue they wanted was only found in France. So that's a good example of like why things change. Yes?
So is this the argument for storing a scheme on a ledger?
Yes, but not just storing it on Ledger, but also making it discoverable using DID URLs, which is now a spec that we've written in the Trust Over IP Foundation. And so the idea is that we want, for example, if SSI really needs to take off, you need to make credentials long-lived and ensure their longevity. I can take a degree that I got like 8 years ago and I can show it to someone and they can still see, okay, a degree from the UK used to look like that back then, and see that it's valid and accurate. I think that kind of like eye on longevity has perhaps not had as much attention in SSI, and so we wanted to ensure it could be done like long term. So that's one of the reasons why we want to keep it on a decentralized ledger. The second is outside of AnonCreds, when you keep it on a web URL, you say, well, what's the problem with keeping it on a web URL? Well, the answer is even the biggest providers have massive outages. So this is a graph of when Facebook went down for 6 hours, and this is not the only time it happened. It has happened multiple times since then. It's happened to AWS, Azure, Google, Oracle, Cloudflare, sometimes due to lightning strikes. This one was because of bad configuration. And the impact of it was apps that were using login with Facebook stopped working because they assumed they could always contact Facebook. So when you opened the app and it couldn't load the login with Facebook button, they all decided to crash. And it's just generally quite centralized as well, like in terms of like infrastructure. The second one is link rot, or like, links, link rot sort of like breaks links on the web all the time. So link rot is the idea that like links over a natural duration will sort of stop working. Timo just mentioned it to me, the blog post that we did where we explained why we wanted to do resources on Ledger itself had broken links by the time he read it. So that just proves my point on why it's a good idea. And the second broader problem is you want to make it tamper evident and resistant to censorship changes. So there is DID Web, there's DID GitHub, but what if GitHub decides to kick you out, or if the web hosting provider goes down? And so when we started looking at, okay, we're going to use that technique to do AnonCreds on Ledger, we started looking at what else could this be used for. So a good example of this is if you had a wallet like for Apple or Google right now, and you wanted a boarding pass, it comes with the visual branding. Most of the time when you look at SSI credentials, you just get a JSON file and a table. And that's fantastic for computers, but that's not how people interact with it. When I have an Apple Wallet like credential for a concert, they are not often, they just don't have the time to scan the QR code. They sometimes might just look at it and just let me through, right? So the visual design of credentials, for example, could also be stored as like resources because it helps people visually understand it. And for example, here, cryptographically perhaps zero difference, but whether I have a gold pass or a silver pass or like a white pass might direct me to a different queue in an airport, and they just need to visually see what design it is. And I think that isn't really tackled right now in a lot of SSI credentials. Yes?
Really interesting. So, but do you also mean to say that you would even store the
So that's how Apple does it. So right now, you don't visually design the whole thing. What they do is they have a file format and specification for saying the background should be this, the logo color is that, and those are the elements. So the individual information remains in an AnonCred or a W3C JSON or JSON LD cred. What the visual representation format defines is how should you then assemble that together and display it on screen. So the background or like the background visual representation is common for everyone, and then you overlay just the information on top.
So, a few questions. What you were just describing about outages and link rot and etc. That's specifically also the problems that are being tackled by IPFS.
Correct. So we don't necessarily, I completely agree, by the way. So more broadly, the spec that we wrote was for being able to resolve to resources using DID URLs. The destination on which they are stored can be anywhere. They can be on traditional web, they can be on IPFS, or they could be on Ledger. In our implementation, we have a limit of 200 kilobytes as the max block size. So you can only store resources up to 200 kilobytes. If you, for example, had a movie file, which was 50 megabytes, you probably don't want to store it on a blockchain anyway. The second thing is IPFS is only content discovery. It's not permanent storage. So IPFS in the background might use something like Filecoin. And in Filecoin, if you don't pay your fees every 3 years, your file does get deleted. So IPFS doesn't necessarily mean permanently accessible storage. It just means there's different ways that you can resolve and get to that storage. But I completely agree. So for certain kinds of resources, you might, for example, store it on IPFS, but still describe it as a DID URL to access that IPFS link. Or you may use DID URLs to access an on-ledger like sort of resource link.
Permanently having it accessible on the ledger creates its own problems with GDPR.
It depends on what is in the resource. For example, if it's just the, so it's not the actual name of the person and the personal information, but it's this shade of brown, this is the British Airways logo, this is the design. That's not in scope of GDPR. So I think.
But then you were starting to depend on the standards for how you format that. Because if
Correct.
Apple were to create a new standard for that, then your permanently stored way of representing it might break, just as the same as almost everything breaks if you put it on the wrong version.
Sure. But I think you can then describe it in multiple ones. Like, for example, Apple's and Google's are not the same. So as an issuer, you might give both the specifications. And in fact, what was interesting is speaking to one of the large SSI projects around the world, they looked at, actually, we need to issue credentials in multiple languages. And so we need to have language equivalences, like it's a law. Like in our jurisdiction, we need to give it in 3 or 4 different languages. So what's the description of the credential? What's the equivalence between them? One example of that is something called the overlay capture architecture from Human Colossus. So we're not necessarily saying that this is the only way to do it. It's that like many different people are solving it in different ways, and you should just make it discoverable and then let people choose what's relevant for their use case. There's obviously the concept of revocation registries. I think the same thing applies to governance policies, trust registries, trust frameworks, documentation as well. I think, and I don't just mean machine readable by that. Like there's been a thing in trust over IP for a long time that people should go and publish their governance framework and make it discoverable through a DID, but nobody had actually done it. So we looked at like, that's an example of like how you could go and publish a governance document in Markdown and say, this is the same governance framework as a machine readable JSON file, a PDF, and a Markdown. So as a client application, you can then choose what do you want. And I think the same thing applies to visual representations of credentials. And then finally, like just branding elements. So a bit like the visual representation. Often on IndyScan or other blockchain explorers, you'll see what nodes are participating and they have logos. Right now, they go and publish this on a website called keybase.io that allows you to publish your PGP key, tie it to your socials, and then you claim it on a blockchain explorer using that. Keybase.io is owned by Zoom. And so essentially, like there are parts of this that we are showing for human trust that go back to centralized architecture, and there's no need to. Like, so you could, for example, very easily describe those assets as well. So I'll breeze through the next bit of it quick, and I'll explain and then hand over to Timo. So the way that we see it, the starting point for having a resource on Ledger is that you create a DID and a DID doc, which we call a resource collection. And then you specify, or like the keys you specify in this simple example can be used to say, that is the key that is allowed to create new resources and sort of update the resource collection. And then once the resource collection has been created, you can create a specific resource that has a unique ID. We use a standard called globally unique identifiers that can be generated by anyone, and it's guaranteed to be unique. It is signed by the keys specified in the DID doc, and then you attach the sort of like actual file or files that create the resource. And then what you can do, or what you see, is that becomes linked to this particular DID doc. So, for example, if you had a schema like schema.org, it's a collaborative effort. You could specify 5 or 6 keys that should agree on like the next version of a schema, and they can sign off on that and publish it on Ledger. And so the what you're seeing over here, this bit of text is just the metadata for that resource that is available along with the DID doc. And so you'll see that there's a unique link to that resource, a collection ID, which is the same as the ID of the publisher. You have a name for the resource, a type, and you can also toggle back between or check if there are previous or new versions of that same resource. And so what this looks in practice is you have a DID URL that can be constructed where you have the issuer and you have the specific resource ID. And in our particular ledger, we can do it in 2 styles, an Indy style identifier or like a UUID style identifier, as we call it. But you can also, and this is the bit that we've been working with Trust over IP, specify it as a query parameter. And this is also more compatible in general than the other way.
Maybe I missed something, but how can you specify that there's a next version of something if you don't?
Oh, so the next version is not like you wouldn't publish the next version yourself. Oops. I think this is linked to a different version of the deck than the one I was editing, actually. But the next version of the resource, you wouldn't put it at, so if this is the first time you created it, next and previous is null. And let's say you publish a new version of the resource, then our contract on Ledger will go and update that field to point to next version as X. This is the, no, it's the same definition that DID docs use, in fact. So DID docs allow also for next version ID, but they don't have previous version ID. But in DID docs also, like the spec allows for stepping between historical and new versions. It's decided based on a combination of resource name and resource type. So that's what we use for uniqueness. Like you can only have that name once. Like any update that you publish becomes an update of that resource rather than a separate resource. But what's interesting is you could publish this as a schema and then, or a cred def, and then you could consume it, make it reusable from other DIDs and other sort of issuer DIDs. Same concept as how cred devs work right now. Any other questions? I think I'm almost near the end for my bit, really. No? Wait, what? I'm very cool.
All right. Hello, everyone. Ankur just told us about checked, what you can do with it in a generic, like, as a ledger. I'm gonna go talk a bit more about a project we've been working on integrating AnonCreds, which have been bound to only the Indy ledger, and how we integrated it with the check network, and basically what we learned and what our goals are going to be for the future in working with AnonCreds and the check network. So, as a short introduction on like what are AnonCreds. AnonCreds are a type of verifiable credential. I think the most well-known is the W3C standard for verifiable credentials, a data model that describes these are the fields we need to have in a JSON structure, and we put a signature on it so we can digitally verify it. AnonCreds is a project that started before the W3C verified credentials were standardized, and it has a focus on privacy-preserving characteristics. So some of the features of it are zero-knowledge proofs. Is every time I show a proof of this credential, the signature actually isn't revealed, but a proof of it. So you can't correlate it between every time I show it. So if I show you my credential to you multiple times, you won't know it's actually the same credential being shown. And that's very unique in digital systems, because almost every time in digital systems we always present unique correlatable identifiers. And there are more features that are specific. So selective disclosure is I can choose to only reveal certain attributes of this credential, so I don't have to share everything. I can do range proofs. So instead of sharing my actual income, I can just share that my income is higher than a certain amount. So I am eligible to rent this apartment, for example. You have a privacy-preserving way to do revocation checks, so no correlatable identifier is shared. And you have private holder binding, and that is making sure this credential is bound to me and cannot easily be shared with someone else. So I think that are the main features of AnonCreds credentials. And as already shown, it currently only works with Hyperledger Indy networks, and that's what we're going to discuss today and how we can change that. So there's a few objects involved with AnonCreds credentials, and these are the objects that we store on Ledger. So that are schemas, which define the attributes of a credential. We have credential definitions, which contains the public keys I'm going to use for signing the actual credential. And we have the revocation registry and entries, which is for defining, well, if a credential can be revoked, and if it is like privacy-preserving way to check if a credential is still valid. So this is a schema. It is very simple. It's just, it defines the attribute names. In this case, we have a name and a nationality, a name and a version. And it's just a plain JSON field, JSON object. And we have a credential definition. Those are the only ones I'll go into depth today. And we just link to a schema and we say like which crypto mechanism we're using. And these are the ones we need to store on Ledger. And currently that's only possible on the Indy network. So there are a few limitations of AnonCreds. I don't know how many of you read it, but there was also recently a post by Kalia on like the Airwise Indy AnonCreds stack. And I think she makes some good points, also some points that I don't agree with, but I think I picked a few from them that are valid, in my opinion, and I think there's a lack of standardization. It's an old, less performant signature algorithm, although I do think that isn't necessarily a problem, because I mean, it's nice to have better performing signature suits, but if the ones we're using today provide features that newer ones can't, I don't think there's a problem with staying at this signature algorithms. There's no cryptographic agility, which is you can't easily swap out the signature or the crypto algorithm being used. It's very tied to one signature suit at the moment. And if you look at Derivative credentials, that's not the case, and that allows for innovation of the crypto aside from the innovation of the data model. And I think that's a good thing to have. So that is a real limitation of AnonCreds at the moment. The revocation is a bit dated and not scalable. Yeah.
That's no longer true. Andrew White wrote a paper and tried a new revocation. And the only reason it's not been implemented yet because there was no money.
Yeah, okay, so the note here is, just for the microphone, is that Andrew White did a paper on the new revocation mechanism. That is true, but there's no implementation of it yet. And I think that's the issue is currently the limitation of AnonCreds is that the revocation is dated and not scalable, and we need people to invest money and resources to actually get this newer, more scalable revocation mechanism. But it is something we are also really interested in. I think it has a lot of potential to work for both AnonCreds and non-AnonCreds credentials. So another point is that it's bound to Indy ledger. So yeah, VC data model, for example, is also not bound to a specific ledger. And I think if you want to have it being used by a lot of people and different organizations with different needs, you want it to be not tied to a single ledger, but have that separate. And there's no need probably to tie it to a single ledger. Yeah, so I think the last point is you need to have the AnonCreds object registered on ledger. I think it could be seen as a limitation, as there are some use cases where you could use credentials completely without anything dependent on the ledger, which in offline use cases is really useful. But yeah, I think this is really a thing of like, what is your use case, what are your requirements, and it could be a pro or a con. So what we mostly want to focus on today is ledger agnostic AnonCreds, and that is allowed to use AnonCreds with any ledger you want, or even without a ledger. You could just host them on an HTTPS server and not use any ledger. So basically, we just remove the dependence to a single place where you store it. And that will solve two of the limitations I just mentioned, which is lack of standardization. So we write a spec, how does this work? And secondly, we remove the binding of the Indy ledger, because you now can use it with any ledger. So not solving all problems, but if we can already solve two now in a relatively easy manner, then we can look at the next steps in the future. How do we keep the characteristics of AnonCreds with a lot of privacy preserving features, but also move forward to more interoperable and more standardized approaches? Because I think we should find a middle ground somewhere in between. And I think what we've noticed now of like looking at this is the issue is mostly with Indy-specific identifiers in the current SDKs and the specifications. So basically, everywhere there's identifiers, we need to be more loose in verification or validation of it, and allow things that work with other types of URIs. And actually, this is also an issue with the new DIT Indy identifiers. Because Ankur just mentioned, like, Indy doesn't support a full DIT spec. They are working on it currently to make that work. I think the code is complete. It just needs to be deployed to the nodes. But even if we have that, the current AnonCreds spec and implementations actually won't work with it. So it's actually also needed to make it work, AnonCreds, with the future of Indy itself. So one thing that has been started, and this is something we're now just getting started to be involved with this, but this is being started by other people, is the AnonCreds specification, and that is just taking the code that is actually now implemented and we're going to standardize it. So it's completely separate from the Hyperledger Indy project and standardized so people can actually make separate implementations. And I think there's a few things that have changed since, like basically from the implemented code to the AnonCreds specification that is now being created, and that is identifiers are now URIs, so that could be did URL, did checked, or did Indy, or it could be an HTTPS URL, can be anything. There isn't a exact binding to DIDs anymore, it was bound to Indy DIDs, but as we said, it can now be an HTTPS server. The removal of transaction number, the sequence number in the schema, which Anchor already mentioned, because there's no need to make it a sequence number. And the models are only the models that are used for the AnonCreds libraries will be standardized. So what's actually stored on the ledger doesn't really matter, because what Indy stores on the ledger is also different than what the AnonCreds library needs. So it's just the interfaces that are needed for exchange between the parties. How you handle it under the hood could be up to you, and you can change that representation as long as you can make the valid objects that are needed in the credential or the proofs. Okay, so maybe before I go to the next section, is there any questions about like what I said right now about AnonCreds? Yeah. Oh.
Sorry, I was just going to mention, we've been working with the AnonCreds working groups and community because we tried to solve this at Checked itself, how do we support AnonCreds. So we've been working with Stephen and a lot of the others on updating the AnonCreds spec itself to be independent of Indy. And so we are also keen to hear feedback over here on how this sort of evolves and how it matches the needs of the community.
Yeah, okay, this is just to repeat it on the microphone, is that Checked has been working with Steven and the AnonCreds specification to make this work with Checked, but also for like in general. And if you have feedback, you can contact Ankur from Checked. Yeah. Harman was...
I don't know if you can easily answer it, but this also can fit, for instance, in a presentation exchange type of architecture that you would have different type of credentials working together.
And you mean the diff presentation exchange spec? Okay, so the question is, would it work with a presentation exchange and that you can combine different credentials? Yeah, I know there has been an extension to the diff presentation exchange, or actually a separate diff specification that just is a registry of different credential formats, and AnonCreds is one of them. So you could actually create a presentation request and support receiving multiple type of credentials in that. So that would be possible, yes. I don't think anyone has implemented it yet, but I think that would be a nice way to use AnonCreds, but also move to different exchange formats over time.
Yeah, so you could, for instance, have a verify request for attributes, one of them coming from an AnonCred, and 3 of them coming from JSON.
Yeah. Okay, so the question, yeah, so that you combine attributes from different credentials, yeah, would be possible. It would be harder in the cryptographic proof, in like assuring the credentials are from the same holder, because it's basically 2 proofs you're making, but you can do that. And I've heard of some use cases where you're using a JSON-LD credential as a bearer credential. So a company is part of a consortium, and then a separate AnonCreds credential that is bound to a specific user. So I am part of that company. And with those 2 credentials, I both prove that I am part of this organization and that this organization is part of a specific consortium. And combined, that is a proof, a valid proof, that is partly W3C credentials and partly AnonCreds. So yeah, I see real use cases for being then used at the same time. Now, Peter. Yeah, there is a specification now on, I think, a few slides back. Yeah, here. There's a AnonCreds working group. There's a specification. And I think in the specification is also a note on AnonCreds v1. And AnonCreds v1 is just we take what is currently implemented in open source and make it ledger agnostic. AnonCreds v2 will focus more on more like combining it with the Derby3C spec while keeping privacy preserving features intact and also focusing on the new revocation mechanism that we just talked about. But I think this would be a good place to start. Yeah.
Is Animo going to be involved in the AnonCreds specification themselves as well?
Yeah.
Are you going to let it handle the check, or are you guys going to be involved?
Okay, yeah, so question is if we're also going to be involved. Yeah, we haven't been as much, but we have, as we will show in a minute, be working on like an integration of AnonCreds with checked. And as part of that, I've been opening some issues in the AnonCreds specification on things we should look at. And I intend to be more involved as we start going towards a more production-ready implementation of AnonCreds. I'll get to that later in the slides, but yeah, we do intend to be involved in this process. Any more questions? Cool, okay. Yeah, so a question you could ask is like, why would we pursue this? I think there's a lot of things to say about adopting Derby3C credentials, and that's also something we are going to do and are working on right now. So it's not saying we choose AnonCreds, we just think there's reasons to work with both. And I think it's just mainly the privacy preserving features that I've already mentioned, and that is, I think, their end goal. And I think also looking at a V2 spec is probably what we'll start with. How can we keep all privacy preserving features intact? And while the Derby3C spec is more about the data model, and they've been adding privacy preserving features in it over time, but there are still a lot of options for correlation if you use it as the plain data model they provide. So what I want to do now is give a showcase that we've been working on with checked of AnonCreds anchored on the check network, that we can do an end-to-end flow. One thing, I don't know if everybody knows here the Animo demo we have, but we've modified it to work with checked. So let me see. Here it is. So on the right, I have a mobile wallet that we created as a demo for this, because there aren't any wallets yet that can connect to the check network, sadly. There's a wallet, and here's the demo, which is modified to work with the check network. So we're gonna walk through the demo. We have Ankur as a character today, and we're gonna walk through it as Ankur today. So first thing is, what we want to do is we want to create a connection. So we'll create a connection, and as you can see, we now have a connection with Animo. Once that is complete, we'll get our starter credentials. In this case, we have an Animo identity with some fields in it for Ankur, and I can accept this credential. Once I accept it, you can see it's going to credential received, and now I actually have the credential in my wallet here. So we now have the foundation, and we thought maybe what a nice use case would be for, now as this is an RWorld pre-event, we're going to attend the Rebooting the Web of Trust with verifiable credentials. Maybe next year they can use actually verified credentials to attend the event. So as a starter, what we're gonna do, create a connection again. Let me see if it can scan the QR code from this far away. Yeah, we're gonna create a connection with RWorld. So I created the connection. I'm going to the next step, and what they basically want to know is they first want to know my fields for my identity. So I'll share these with my name, and it will send the presentation, and then another side will receive these fields, and if everything goes okay, they will issue our Airworld Conference Pass. I'll accept this, and this is done. And the next step is, of course, now I have this in my wallet, I'm going to attend Airworld, and I will need to show this pass. So I will show, and I accept, and I will just share my name, and then I'm in. So if you've followed this demo before, it doesn't actually look any different because the ledger, the end user doesn't really interact with the ledger, but I can promise you that this is running on the checked network. So one thing how you can notice it is if I complete this, well, yay, we finished. So for example, if I go to this credential and I built in a small debug UI here, normally you won't see this, but as you can see here, the credential definition ID is actually now did checked, and we're running this on the testnet, and you can see it is a resource URL that Anchor showed before. So instead of using, basically it's all the same, but instead the objects used are now anchored on the check network, and the versions of Airstream with JavaScript that are running this are not connected to the Indy network at all. So they're only connecting. Yeah, so we're quite happy with that. We were able to build this. It was in quite a short time frame, but we had to make quite a few hacks. Yeah. What's your?
No, I was just going to ask you if it was implemented very neatly and reusable.
No. The backend looks terrible, but we really wanted to showcase that it is possible and learn from it, like what do we need to do to actually make this possible on a production level. And I think the path forwards is quite clear for us now, but there's work that needs to happen. So, go ahead.
Do you have to change the wallet applications or AFJ to support this as well? And is that source code available for curious viewers / is there an app?
Yeah, this the question is this code available? We had to make modifications to Airstream with JavaScript core at the moment, and that is publicly available. It's on our Animo GitHub in a fork in a separate branch, so you have to dig. I can send the link afterwards. But currently we had to make changes to the core, and I will talk to a bit like how we want to approach this in a generic way in a minute. And basically what we want to do is plug in AnonCreds interfaces. So if you want to plug it into another ledger, you can do so by yourself without modifying the core of the framework, which currently was needed because the framework is expecting that it is only bound to an Indy network. Cool. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. The app itself, is it available in an app store around us?
It's not available on the App Store. It's currently like an internal build that we're using, mainly because it is like a demo wallet and not really something we would like to publish to the App Store in the moment. But it is. I think we can probably make the source code available because it's just it's the same wallet we used last week at a workshop we gave, but then just change the colors a bit. But we do hope, of course, that soon a wallet will be in the stores that supports it. Yeah.
No technical guy here, so it looks very great. But what did I just have seen, and for whom or which organization would this be interesting?
Good question. So the question is not a technical guy. What I have just seen, for who would that be interesting, right? I think it would be interesting for anyone that wants to build SSI solutions, and particularly I think a good portion of interest would be people that are currently working with Indy and are having some issues with either their governance model or their scalability. But it could also be people new to SSI that need a place to anchor their AnonCreds objects and want to use the check network for it. So basically it is currently already possible. We have another demo at demo.animo.id that works with Hyperledger Indy, and we want to just make it possible to use the network you want. I don't know, maybe Anchor has some good additions on this in terms of from check's point of view.
Sure. So we have about 35 SSI partners on our network, and a lot of them currently use Hyperledger Indy. And I think a lot of the interest has been we want more up-to-date bid docs that the W3C spec allows, which we can't do right now. Number two is we want better scalability for all of the different kinds of objects. But outside of that, some of our SSI partners have also been from not Hyperledger Indy as a background. So we've also integrated with some other SDKs that don't come from this background. So I'd say, like, in terms of like use case, what you're seeing right now is designed for developers who are building identity applications. Now, these developers, some of them are working on company background checks, some of them are working on identity for doctors and employment records, some of them are building national sort of like digital ID schemes, some of them are building here's a way to do reputation on DAOs, so it's a broad range. But what you saw just now is how can these developers who are building identity applications use this more privacy-preserving digital credential standard without using Hyperledger. And I think, if I'm not wrong, this is the first time that there's an AnonCred credential that's not on Indy, right?
Yeah, I think one of your employees built an integration with Fabric as a internship project, but I don't think they followed the new AnonCreds specification with different URIs.
So it's not
Throw his intern under.
Yeah, well, no, I think he was the first, and he just came to us like, "Can I present this at your working group call?" And we were all like, "Oh, this is amazing." That's so no, not really. Yeah, yeah.
But I think it's good because this is not about just whether AnonCreds work with checked, but for the health of the ecosystem, it should work with any ledger. Is the whole point.
Yeah.
So this is not about whether it's on Indy or checked. It's like it should be able to work on any ledger, and that's how it becomes ubiquitous.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right.
How far are you away from being the issuer for revocation? Amber said in the beginning, right?
You can do revocation now, but like the implementation hasn't been done by anyone yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this demo uses schemas and credefs because a lot of the work has been in the AnonCreds working groups on how to change identifier formats and styles.
Right.
So it's mostly been like, what do we agree on those should change to? Now it's no longer on Indy. You can create revocation registry definitions and entries on Ledger, and
Does that result in a payment to the issuer?
no. So like the original idea is like you can right now unchecked use the resources module to publish an AnonCreds revocation entries or the status list 2020-2021 because we don't gate anything on resources. We just give a blank slate and say you can write anything you want. Right?
Yeah.
So we charge you for writing to the ledger. The bit that we want to build next is charging people for reading in certain scenarios if the issuer has set it to that. We don't expect read fees to be the default. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
To recap, the question is like, can we very quickly is, can we already like pay for revocation on the network, and is it already possible? And the answer is you can put AnonCreds revocation registry and definitions on the network. You can also use the W3C status list revocation method, but there's no way to actually pay yet for verifying on the network. Oh, yeah.
To follow on that, so the unique selling point of checks is basically the ability to be able to create a payment file. The unique selling point of AnonCreds is to be able to be very privacy preserving, but both of these USPs don't really come out in this demo, right? I mean, it's a good proof of concept, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily leveraging why you should exactly use AnonCreds or checks.
Yeah, okay, to repeat this, checked stands for payments of credentials, and AnonCreds is for privacy preserving features, and this demo doesn't really show those features. I would say the payments not yet, because that isn't possible yet, but it does show the privacy preserving features of AnonCreds in this demo, same as you would have with Indy. So those are shown, because we're using the privacy preserving features of AnonCreds.
And the scalability.
So yeah, that's hard to show in the demo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I know I realize the limitations of the demo, but because you're actually now also the request when you're presenting your credentials to actually again asks for your name. I would say that's a bit superfluous. If you have a credential, all you would have to show is I'm actually allowed to come into this conference. You don't need to ask my name.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's probably something we should have done better in this demo, to not actually share correlatable data. I think that's also a point that is often made about AnonCreds, is that there's so much work being put in keeping everything non-correlatable, but in the end, most events in terms of verification rely on correlating things back to your identity. So in a lot of cases, do we really need it? And that is a good discussion to have. I know some people that find it really important, especially governments, to keep that non-correlatable to the max. And I think some cases not necessarily, no.
But also, like, you don't have to use zero knowledge all the time. Like, if you go into a conference, you're going to say hi to people and tell them your name, unless it's a conference for anonymous.
No, yeah, but I mean, it would be nice to be able to say, okay, the only reason you want my name is to put it on my name tag, but that could be that could be my pseudonym. But
Yeah.
maybe for government reasons you need my real name, and that's where the actual verifiable is.
Yeah, yeah, no, it makes sense. But I think then in most times at events they would like to correlate it because they want to know you bought the ticket and not someone else is going in with your ticket. But yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, well, not a question, but to add to what if you show the QR code, or if you go to get beer, you need to be 18 plus. You're not going to ask him, is his name Sebastian? You just need to scan the QR code and show, yeah, he's 18 or not. Same here. If you walk up to the Eventbrite with your RWOT, show the QR code, you get in, and it's a VAT, and then it's done. I mean, I've never shown my passport or my driver's license when I go to any event to get in. You just get the ticket, you show the ticket. So what you did show is that with your demo is that, yeah, of course you could have shown the QR code. In general, it works the same way in the back. So the visualization is different.
Yeah, yeah.
So for me, what you guys did is exactly how it's supposed to be, except the name in the first name is not native, but yeah, the step to visualize it in the QR code is probably an hour work for you guys.
But if you think about it, if you sign up for Rebooting Web of Trust, you go on the Eventbrite. There's
Yeah,
a
exactly.
QR
But then
code.
if you give
Yeah.
them more information, give
So-
your cell number, give where you live,
Yeah.
they don't need that.
No.
They
Yeah.
only need to know did you pay,
Yeah.
and here's your QR code.
Sure.
Here's your ticket.
Right.
There was
That's it.
about a 3-year-long question mark. question.
How annoying is that I have to wear a tag all the time with your name if I don't want to share my name or
Yeah.
anything? Why should
But I
do
mean,
it?
like, you can put in Donald up there for
Yeah,
all
sure.
the
Yeah, but you
And
have to
you
say
can-
that
you
your
can
name
do
is
that on
Sebastian,
this
I can say I'm Anna.
Yeah.
We still walk around with
Sure.
those
I
names.
mean, basically the same.
Basically,
Yeah,
the same.
basically the
I
same.
do want to save a bit of this for the discussion afterwards,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is a good discussion to have.
Eat all of this for my
No, I stopped with that.
Next time we do a microphone for the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, yeah, but to recap a bit on like what we did here is we put the AnonCreds object, so the schemas and the credential definitions in this case, on the check network, and it uses the checked resources on Ledger to store these AnonCreds. And we integrated this into the IRSang JavaScript Ledger service and made a new implementation of that, and we leveraged the checked SDK for that. So they provide a TypeScript SDK that with modules that you can use to either create DIDs or create resources, which is quite easy in this case. And as I already said, some hacks were needed to make this work, which I'll discuss in the next slides. I think I had to put a diagram here. Maybe I can go over that in a bit, but yeah, yeah. So yeah, maybe I'll get to that later. But so the resource provides a generic way to store data on the ledger. So this is a perfect use case in this case to do AnonCreds, because there aren't any changes needed to the checked network for us to make this extension. I think that is a really strong point, because it means we can also do this for like the visual representations or the overlay capture architecture that Anchor talked about earlier. Is we can, like with Indy, it's sometimes if we want to store a new object, we need to change the ledger code, and that is a slow process because it's the core of the network. You need to make the contributions. All nodes need to deploy it. If we can get something generic, and the clients can basically do that extra step of validation, I think it will open up for a lot more, more rapid innovation, and something I'm quite excited about. Well, I posted the link here if you're interested in reading about how it works on the check network. Yeah?
Yeah, is the check network then dynamic enough to also provide the ability to do W3C based on things if you want to?
That was the first kind of credential we launched.
Okay.
Yeah, so
there since April.
That's awesome. Is
Yeah.
it just generic blobs effectively? Okay. Cool.
yeah, so AnonCreds or like on-ledger resource is just generic blobs that you can store on the network. So it can be JSON, can be images, can be anything. Yeah, so one of the hacks we had to do right now is transformation of identifiers. So the top is like an Indy-style legacy schema identifier, and we now had to transform that to this. We're currently still using the Indy SDK, which has the old type of validation. So actually what we need to do is every time after we get an object from the Indy SDK back, we go over the whole object structure, and all legacy style identifiers, we transform those, and then we can send them over the wire to the other agent. So from issuer to holder, for example. And we do the same otherwise. So if we receive an object, we check all identifiers, and we transform the checked resource identifiers back to the Indy identifiers. This is for now a hack that allowed us to make it work. We intend to modify the libraries over time to work with both identifier types. Yeah, there was another issue with checked DIC documents, or not with checked DIC documents, but mostly that the Indy SDK can't export a private key. And we had basically two SDKs that both need to sign something, and they couldn't like use each other's keys. So we basically added two keys to the DID document, but that's exactly what DID documents are made for. You can add multiple keys to the same identifier that can both have control over the document. And if I open this, the diagram or the, okay, cool. Yeah, so this is the DID document. Doesn't really matter that much what the structure of it is, but as you can see here, these are all the resources that are linked to this. We've been doing quite some demos with this, so but these are all the, so you can also discover like which is something that's not possible in Indy, and something I've had multiple clients of us request over time is like, hey, we want to basically be able to discover which credentials does an issuer issue. And that's quite hard to do with Indy, but now you could like find all the related credential definitions and just find out, all right, these types of credentials, and then you can have the holder-driven model where basically I propose, hey, I would like you to issue this credential to me instead of the issuer starting the interaction. So I think something that can help open up some new use cases. Yeah. So I think quickly go over it. Checked already integrated with the Veramo SDK, which is another popular TypeScript SDK for building SSI applications. And here's their whole, basically library stack. Currently, we were working on integrating AeroStream with JavaScript, and as you can see, we can just use the checked SDK for this, and they integrate with the Cosmos library. They have a DIT module and a resource module, so this makes it quite easy for us to integrate with the check network, and we don't have to build everything from scratch. Kareem? Okay, yeah. Good question. Okay, and I'll go over it quickly. I think there's, we get the ID. This is, I think, probably interesting to mention. So there's now an object registry which defines multiple methods, just like we have with DIT. You have DIT checked, DIT Indy, DIT solved, DIT Ion, DIT, well, there's 90 of them, so I'm not going to list them all, but we can have multiple. So there's the new DIT Indy, there's the checked one, but there's also an HTTP one that we can all use with AnonCreds. So I think we already discussed this a lot, but quickly, I think why we chose checked for this integration is the on-ledger resources allow extensions, it's public, it's focused on identity, and in the future it will allow for payments, which will, I think, open up a lot of use cases. And so this is what we want to work on next, is actually implement ledger agnostic AnonCreds in a production ready way, and do it in 3 basic work packages where we have like the ledger agnostic AnonCreds with a base open source AnonCreds implementation. We have an implementation of ledger agnostic AnonCreds in AeroStream with JavaScript that would work with both checked and DIT Indy. And we do the same in Ares Cloud Agent Python, so we can do the work of ledger agnostic AnonCreds with checked and Indy in Ares Cloud Agent Python. I'll skip over these for now, but basically what we want to do is make a generic interface, just as we are used to with DIT resolvers, is we create DIT resolvers for each type of DIT method. So we have an Indy DIT resolver, we have a check DIT resolver, and we can repeat that pattern for AnonCreds. And this way we can dynamically use multiple AnonCreds methods at the same time. Because the demo we just showed was just hard-coded to use checked, and normally we are hard-coded to use Indy. It will be possible to dynamically use AnonCreds in both AeroStream with JavaScript and Ares Cloud Agent Python. Harm.
Maybe you'll mention it, but it's not, this is kind of demo stuff, right? But if you want to do this for real, you have some kind of estimation, like would that be a 1 year work, 6 month work, of course, depends on how you do it. But do you have some kind of thought?
I think it would be a few months of work, dependent on how many people collaborate, but we've seen a lot of interest from different parties in both the checked community, but also the Hyperledger Indy community where this is needed for. I think if we have the help from a lot of different organizations, we could probably do this in 2 to 3 months, I think, definitely. And then we have like a production-ready implementation of the AnonCreds, which is an open source library that can be used outside of Ares projects. And we also have the implementation in both AeroStream with JavaScript and Ares Cloud Agent Python. So I think it should be that time frame. I think we're out of time a bit. So one thing I do maybe want to show is we want to do like ledger agnostic AnonCreds, and that's part of like in AeroStream with JavaScript we want like a agnostic approach in general, and that is like we don't want to pick just AnonCreds, we just want to pick credential formats, and I think the API we now have showcases how that would work, because I can create an offer, a credential offer, and in the top you see like the Indy key. Well, that will be transformed to an AnonCreds key over time. But I can make that offer, but I can at the same time also include a similar, that is like semantically the same, but not the same data structure, that is a JSON-LD credential. And that way you can use it for both AnonCreds and JSON-LD credential formats at the same time, or just JSON-LD, whatever fits your use case. And we have like a single API that you can use for this. And I think there's some items on the roadmap we want to work towards, is like the full support for the ledger agnostic AnonCreds, the full checked integration. We move away from the Indy SDK to make it more generic. We want to work towards an extension for OpenID Connect, because there's a lot of lower level parts already in Airstream with JavaScript that we can reuse, and we should just have the top level protocol layer different, and then we can, basically if we have that, then we'll be interoperable with all the current SSI standards. And I think that is something we really want to move towards to, is just pick and choose what you want. We provide a toolkit to work with that. And some other, like DITCOM v2 and the other ARP2 standards we're still missing. I think we're almost complete, but there are some minor RFCs that we're missing. So AnonCreds has some limitations. There's a lot of work happening. And we're working at the moment mostly on 2 limitations. There have been 3 showcases now of anchoring AnonCreds on non-Indy ledgers. There's the Fabric one, we have the check one, and there's an HTTPS one pull request in ACAPI now made, but those 2 still use like the legacy Indy style identifiers, and something we really wanted to show in this showcase is we don't have to use the Indy identifiers. We can move to more like really unique URIs to be able to locate resources. So if you're interested to collaborate with this on us, because we're working with a lot of people from the ACAPI project, a lot of people that work on AnonCreds or checked, please reach out to me, because we would really like either your input or your help in contributions or funding. We would like to make this like a collaborative project to get this work from the ground. So thanks everyone. You can always reach out to me or Ankur after this, or just ask us a question in a bit. And I think we may answer some questions, but I think we can also just get to drinks. I don't know how we're doing on time. Okay, well, maybe do a few questions if there are any.
Yeah, it's still fine for them. Maybe our big time slot in which all of the questions are asked is already good.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to figure some questions. What are the biggest challenges then?
What are the biggest challenges ahead? I think mostly standardization and development. There's a spec that is started but not finished yet. There is a code base that we can use as a starting point from Indy, but that needs to be modified. So I think there's a lot of just people that want to invest time or money into this project to get it working, because I think we know we have showcased it, we know where we need to go, but now we need to do it in a good and production ready way, and that always takes time and resources. Yeah, Harman.
Did you somehow discuss this with people from public authorities in Europe? I think that AnonCreds in general are really interesting because of price and certain characteristics. But at the same time, I think you've explained quite clearly that there's challenges with the current ways of using AnonCreds. So also in the light of the European identity wallet and those things, this is super relevant. So I think this is such a super technical discussion that I think 99.9% of people won't understand it. But it is a super crucial thing in this super general discussion of the European wallet, right? So do you know if people within the government are already looking at this or participating?
Yeah, okay, so to recap, is did we also talk to European like governments or policy makers? I would say not that much, because I think the ARIs and AnonCreds like credentials are mostly being used that we see in like overseas in America and Canada, for example. Like British Columbia government is very involved with AnonCreds. I would say not that much, because it doesn't really align with like the OpenID Connect tech stack. But we would be really interested to talk to those people, because we know a few that are working. I think the Luxembourg like initiative for SSI is working a bit with AnonCreds, so they may be interested in it. But I think all the ones that are really focused on OpenID Connect and Do-It-3C credentials, it probably doesn't relate to them as much.
I can add a bit more to that actually.
Yeah.
So there's quite a few of our partners who are part of IDU, which is a German consortium. I think the challenge is that a lot of the SSI consortiums in Europe have chosen Hyperledger Indy because it's a private permissioned ledger and they can choose who's participating in it. And they make a big deal out of it. But at the same time, EU SFLab has funded a lot of public ledgers and networks and wallets as well. So they basically don't have a consistent framework. And I personally think their reason for choosing a private network is a bit irrational anyway. Like, none of the people running nodes are double checking the information being written to the ledger. They're confusing validity from a consensus level with what is inside the DID doc. And that doesn't make sense. Like, none of these nodes, even if you choose, these are 25 German companies writing to the Indy ledger, they're not checking what's inside the DID doc. So I think the standards are evolving though, and I think once they start seeing examples of something outside of Hyperledger Indy implementing AnonCreds, we wanted to almost lead with that and show it as an example of why it will be more scalable and faster, because otherwise it's just a theoretical fight.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I think this current European discussion is also very top-down in some ways.
Yeah.
Like as tech partners, we experience it's a pretty top-down discussion. But I think what you said is also how we always feel like tech companies are very bottom-up. Like, oh, we'll first implement it and then we'll show them. Currently, the decisions are being made, and we'll have to follow in some way. So it's kind of a disconnect still, I think.
But I've worked on a lot of Hyperledger Indy projects with the governments, and I kept people, I saw governments building private network after private network after private network, and the consequence of that is a user has to download 50 different apps.
Yeah.
And they're defeating the purpose that they set out to achieve in the first place. And so I think some of the policies don't really personally make sense, but I think we also need to show them I think it's important for the health of AnonCreds and Europe in general to say you're not relying on one single software stack to achieve this, because if it is vulnerable and it gets compromised, then you've laid all your eggs in one basket. You shouldn't do that for critical infrastructure like identity.
But it's the same with AnonCreds, right? I mean, you're not going to get entire Europe to go for AnonCreds. So make sure that it's interoperable, they can exchange the information with each other that's needed.
Yeah.
But again, it's safe infrastructure central and Apple for verified credentials. If you're going to go for Anon, it's utopia to think everybody will do it.
Yeah. But I think we implemented and show it, and I think EU has made some of the best moves in trying to encourage competition, the way they work with Apple, Google, and try to break up that monopoly. And I think saying that everybody should use AnonCreds or everybody should use W3C or this flavor is a bit like saying everybody should drive the same car or buy the same brand of ketchup. It's never going to happen. or like buy the same phones. Like you should give like people the ability to choose the one you want, even if you think one is superior or inferior, and then just let people choose. Otherwise,
But it's still identity.
Sure.
I mean, it's not a random
No, I know.
carton of milk
I know,
or
but
your
like
favorite soft drink or something. It's
sure.
identity. And
But what I'm saying is like even in software, there are like many different languages. Governments, by definition, they often try and not use one software vendor. They try and spread that risk by using multiple languages, using multiple software vendors, multiple database types, and it's a critical part of ensuring that like everything doesn't go down because of a single vulnerability. It's the same way that they don't try and not use the same operating system, or you shouldn't use the same web processing software. Like it's been the core principle of European Union to try and have that competitive.
I think you also see that in the wallets.